She would roar into my face as loud as she could, and it would just make the tears spring to my eye. As a freshman in college, I didn't know whether I wanted to be a writer or a zoologist. And I had a very bad stutter at that time, which you can hardly notice now by comparison, about 25 times as bad as now. And so that was of course part of the reason for my focus on writing and also on the love for animals, because since it was hard for me to talk to anyone except close friends, I didn't stutter much with close friends, but it limited my social life with people, and therefore I was close to dogs and reptiles and possums and the things that lived in the Connecticut woods. And so I wrote a letter from my dormitory, I think in the spring, this would have been the spring of '51, to the Ringling Bros winter quarters in Sarasota, simply asking if I could work with animals in the circus in my summer vacation. I got a little letter back from winter quarters saying, yes, just join whenever you can, when you join, when school's over. So that was, it was as simple as that. Afterwards, of course, once I worked in the circus, I realized that they hired people every day because they had an enormous turnover at my level. We were only paid $14 per week for a 16-hour day or a 14-hour day. So I went home to New Canaan, Connecticut after not graduation, but after finals in my freshman year. And, you know, I spent as much time with my parents as I had to maintain friendly relations, but I was very eager to get to the circus. And the circus was playing in Plainville, Connecticut, which is a town very close to Hartford. That they were not playing in Hartford because they had the great circus fire. So after I got to Plainville, you know, I just found where the circus lot was, and I had this little letter in my hand. It was only 3 sentences long. You know, it was just a tiny little note saying, yes, we will hire you in the animal department. It said, in the animal department, which I didn't know what that meant. Join when you can. So I walked on to the circus lot, and of course I was totally green. I mean, I'd worked in an animal hospital taking care of dogs and cats, but I thought, you know, well, that must mean someone green like me means you take care of horses. So I walked up to one of these cowboys, small men with big hats, and I stuttered very, very badly at this time. I mean, I don't just mean on this occasion, but always. I mean, in fact, I satisfied my language requirement at college by studying Latin, because unlike French or Spanish, you didn't have to speak Latin to pass the course. So I didn't have to speak. And so, I mean, I did stutter a little to him trying to talk. I mean, he perceived that I couldn't talk, but I had this letter. So he looked at it and he said, this isn't the animal department. This is ring stock. And that's all he said. He just turned his back on me. So I had my letter. So I thought, well, you know, we're out. Well, all right. My God, they're going to let me take care of elephants? My God, I'm taking care of dogs and cats, you know. But that, if it's not horses, then... So the elephants were not hard to find, either, as I say, the 24 elephants. And I walked up to one of these big, tall, strapping elephant men, and after I'd found the 24 elephants who were staked, in place with their bales of hay to eat and stuff, and I showed him the letter. He perceived that I couldn't speak, so he looked at my my letter and he said, "This isn't the animal department. These are the elephants. What's the matter with you?" But then he took sufficient pity on me to understand that I didn't know what the animal department meant, which meant the menagerie. That's what it meant. So he said, "Look for number 10 wagon." He said, "Look for number 10 wagon." So I saw this number 10 on a small wagon. I walked toward it, and I found about 4 or 5 men standing there. And there was a horse lying on the ground, a dead horse. And I walked up to the person who seemed the most confident, or most in command, who I don't think turned out to be the person who was the boss, but it doesn't matter. But anyway, I showed him the letter. I couldn't speak. The handicap's fine as long as it didn't prevent you from doing your work. And they pointed at the horse. And I realized that a circus, I joined the circus to take care of megafauna. I realized, I knew that, I just had never dreamed that I would get that kind of a job, but I realized that a circus has lions and tigers in it, and that they eat meat, and that they don't, the circus doesn't go to a butcher shop. So I realized that they were saying, "Chop up this horse." And of course, if it had been a live horse and they'd handed me a pistol, I wouldn't have done it. I would have gone home. But the horse had already been shot, and so I wasn't harming the horse. And so I did attempt to chop it up. And of course, I was not able to, because I didn't know where to aim the axe. In order to chop off the legs, I didn't know the precise place to aim the axe. But I proved to them that, first of all, I would do what I was told if they hired me, and that I was able-bodied. I was capable of chopping wood or whatever. But I had sneakers on, and they were slipping in the blood. And they realized that they didn't really expect me to chop up the horse, and they didn't want me to get hurt because I was slipping in the blood. So they took the axe away and said, "Okay," and they put me in the charge of a man called Bible, and he was called Bible because he'd become born again while he was in prison. He was an ex-convict, but he'd been born again, and so I was given into his charge to watch out for me as a newcomer, and I was fond of him, and he was nice to me, and we got along well, and he was in charge of taking care of the monkeys. We had green monkeys, and the second species slips my mind at the moment, but I think we had 3 different kinds of monkeys, and then we had an orangutan, baby orangutan, and I helped with that, and I helped with the giraffes, and I helped with the hippo, and with the wildebeest, and
the rhinos.
The rhino, we just had one rhino, yeah, and with we had at sometimes we had a tapir. And we had different animals besides the big cats. I was not allowed to work with them until, I'd been broken in quite properly. And we only spent one day in Plainville, so we loaded onto the train that evening, and I slept in my bunk with a man who was so fat or large, husky, that I had to sleep with my arms over my shoulder because there wasn't space for them alongside my body unless I lay on my side. Under those living conditions, which I personally at 18 found perfectly comfortable. We were up at 4:30 in the morning as the train would pull into each new town. It was still operating. This is the Ringling Bros. Marmon Bailey Circus. It was still operating under canvas. The tent, the big top, held 11,000 people, and it had 24 elephants traveled with us on the second train. There were 3 trains. We traveled on the first train that arrived first in the morning, about 4:30 in each new town every day. Second train had the 24 elephants and 90 horses, for example. 11,000 people in the big top. It had a special sideshow tent. The big top was large enough that sometimes the menagerie cages were under the big top. They were in the entrance area. They weren't always outdoors or facing the sideshow on the midway. I mean, of course, there were food booths on the midway. There were for the cotton candy and the candied apples and the other things that people go to the circus for. And there was never a separate menagerie top while I was there, no. And I'm very glad there wasn't, because if there had been, I would have had to help put it up and tear it down. We simply had to open up the cages, flaps that close the cages at night from the wind and cold and so on, keep the animals up. Our next stop was Albany, New York. From Plainville, Connecticut. And so we stayed there about 3 days, and so I got my Social Security card there for the first time. And I went into Albany to the office and had to have that to be hired, of course. And I slept along with Bible in the orangutan's cage because if we stayed overnight in these towns, we had to be wary of being mugged or rolled or whatever you want to call it by local toughs who were even tougher than the circus people. I mean, they weren't tougher than the Elephant Man. They wouldn't have robbed them, but they'd be looking for someone just sleeping on the ground without any protection. So all of the circus people who stayed on the lot overnight, as opposed to going back to the train and sleeping on the train where you were safe. The performers, of course, went back to their compartments on the third train, and those of us work hands who wanted to sleep on the train would be allowed to, but most of us preferred to be, out in the open air. After I started to take care of the big cats, then I always slept under the lion's cage in towns where we stayed overnight. Big places like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Rochester, etc. Because the lions would lie there, stretched out with their paws through the bars to give them extra space for their paws and all. And so I'd be under the lion's wagon with their paws hanging out around me. And if a mugger or whatever wanted to robbed me. The guy, if he hadn't been torn apart by the lions, would have had a heart attack when he snuck up and they roared at him. He would have. I mean, I was totally safe in the care of the lions over my head, and I loved to hear them roar. They used to, and we had certain hours that we had to stand close to our animals. Partly to protect the animals from the people, so they wouldn't start. Your kids wouldn't throw stones, at the chimpanzee or something, or stick their arm in the chimpanzee would snap an arm off like that. I mean, if the wrong person did it. But the hippo had her own cage, and she was a favorite of ours because we could show off for the local girls by scratching the inside of her mouth. And when she got tired of that position, she would slightly move her jaws, just very slightly, but sufficiently that I felt the movement, and then I would pull my arm out and she would clap her jaws shut. And of course, if she hadn't warned me, if she'd wanted to tear my arm off, all she would have had to do was not warn me, but clap her jaws shut without warning. But she liked us, and we liked her. But it corresponded to some extent to what the so-called tick birds do for wild hippos in Africa. She had her own cage with a tank of water, of course, and the rhino had his cage. I used to rub the rhino's cheeks also, but externally, of course, he didn't have a huge jaw. And scratch around his horn and things like that he couldn't do for himself. Just like you scratch a dog where the dog can't reach, you scratch a rhino where the rhino can't reach. And he liked that also. I mean, if he'd wanted to crush my arm against the bars once it was inside the cage, he could have simply swung his head and crushed my arm, but of course he didn't, because he knew us also, and we fed him, and he liked being scratched, so he was careful not to hurt us. And leopards lived in one cage because it was a mother named Sweetheart and her 3 offspring who were full grown by now, but because they were family, the 4 of them were able to live in the same cage without fighting or quarreling, whatever, and they had been raised by the beautiful aerialist who was married to Dr. Henderson, the circus veterinarian, and she used to visit them once in a while and make sure that we were taking care of them well, of course. I could trust my life to them also. I used to put my arms in the cage through the bars. The bars were wide enough that the cats could swipe their paws out through the bars and hurt somebody if they wanted to hurt someone close enough, and a person could stick. We could stick our arms all the way into the cage. The bars are wide enough. So I used to do that with those 4 leopards, and they would play with my arms without stripping all the flesh off as they could have if they had chosen to, with their claws, or chewing my arms off with their jaws. If I sort of wanted to pull out again, they would just tighten their fangs, we'll call it, on my hand sufficiently that I knew I was not going to get my arms back unless until they were ready to let go. They would lie under my arm, holding onto my hand the way they would. They would a gazelle in the wild, and bicycle with all four paws against the bottom of my arm, but keep the claws in. So so they were practicing disemboweling my arm without actually disemboweling my arm. They just kept the claws in. Then we had 2 female tigers and 1 huge male tiger, which I didn't fool with. I was very careful with that male tiger, who every year managed to pull the arm off of a young cage hand, because he seemed to be so tame and placid, and invited you to, seemed to invite you to scratch his beautiful coat. But so some 18-year-old who'd just been hired would start by stroking his ribs, and he would just lie perfectly still, not get angry, not roar, not anything, or resist. And then eventually a young guy would be scratching his shoulder, the tiger's shoulder, and then suddenly the tiger, when the hand reached close enough, suddenly the tiger would grab the hand and just tear his arm off, and the circus would send the kid to the local hospital to have the stump sewn up. And he might be able to stay overnight at the hospital. When I say, the brutality is almost unspeakable. The day after this had happened, I saw it firsthand. The guy was in agony. I was eating in the cookhouse, the cook tent, at the same time he was eating the day after his arm had been torn off. He had this big bandage in his stump. And every time someone sat down on the bench, just the little jarring of the bench in the cookhouse caused him agony. And the next thing, they stuck him on a Greyhound bus, and the agony of that trip home is unspeakable to think of. And of course, after he got home, let's say he's still alive, maybe about my age, no one in his hometown has ever believed his story. Oh, I got my arm torn off by a tiger. That no one believes that.
Well, given that these were caged animals, what would you say was the quality of the care they received from the people?
Yeah, well, the intention was always to have it be humane. Our two bosses, C.R. Montgomery was the director of the menagerie, or whatever you want to call it, and then the on-site boss whose office was number 10 wagon, who spent all day, every day inside number 10 wagon. He had a little space there. When new kids were hired to do this job, there was a tremendous turnover, as I began by saying a long time ago, that because most of the people either were alcoholics or had been, and they would fall off the wagon and start drinking, and they would miss the circus train because they'd be drinking in a bar, and they would never catch up again, or they would manage to climb onto the train drunk onto a flat car after it. when it was leaving, but then they would, halfway between towns, they would fall off the flat car somewhere and, break a shoulder or fill their face with gravel or something, and they would never reappear. So we were constantly hiring new people, not just our department, the menagerie, but all the other departments were constantly hiring new people. There would be occasionally people hired who wouldn't bring water to the big cats 3 times a day. They might, just skip the noon thing, and no one would know. That kind of thing might happen. But it's not that there would be acts of committed cruelty. There'd be acts of omissions, because someone was lazy, someone was sleeping. The fact that you had so little sleep on the train meant you slept during the day, any chance you had, some people. And, they might sleep through some time when they were supposed to be caring for the animals. The only time that I ever saw cruelty to the cats, at least, was sometimes if cage hands got angry at a cat because using this long iron rod. I mean, it was thin. It wasn't a thick thing, but light. But it was possible to ram it directly into the lion again and again. The lion would retreat to the end of the cage, but the rod would reach that far. And if someone was angry at the lion, they could just stand there and ram it against the lion. The lion would roar and strike at the iron with its paw, but it was helpless. And the elephant men were all large men, tall men. They were big, strapping, strong men who could whack an elephant with the elephant hook, which is a club with a hook on the end of it. That they used to whack them as if it was a baseball bat if they wanted to discipline them or were angry. So they were not men that you at all quarreled with. The elephant men would have resented if one of us cage hands had started messing with their elephants. And by the same token, if an elephant man had come over and said, "Hey, I want to scratch the hippo," I would say, "Hey, this is my, take care of the elephant." I'm the one that gets to scratch the inside of the hippo's mouth. But I did like to stroke everybody's favorite elephant, who was named Ruth, a very famous circus elephant who liked people and was affectionate. And I wouldn't do it when the elephant men were around or observing, but I would stand next to her, because sometimes she was staked, her feet were staked close to one of my cages, and so I would stroke her, and I would sometimes lie down close to her feet, so if she had wanted to crush me, she could have, but of course she didn't want to. I mean, with all the animals, I chose which ones were friends. I loved animals, and I trusted them, and I was in the process of developing a lifetime of affinity and intuition with wildlife, which has carried me through 9 trips to Alaska and 5 trips to Africa and 2 trips to India, and so on and so on. The circus is a paradigm for life itself. I worked in the circus in the summers of 51 and 52. In 52, I was finishing my sophomore year, and that's when I had realized more and more that between the choice of being a zoologist and a writer, I was probably going to choose being a writer. I didn't make that ultimate decision until the end of my college career, when I sold this book, Catman. So at the end of the summer, after my sophomore year, September of 52, I was starting to be a junior, and I knew I wanted to write a circus novel. And at that time, my father had told me I could never go back to the circus again, or he'd stop paying my tuition. But I just smiled because I knew I had enough material. And so I worked extraordinarily hard on that novel for my junior and senior year. Even with a real load of reading for homework from my official coursework, I worked 40 hours per week on my writing as a junior in college. And as a senior, I upped that to 50 hours per week on my writing, which is approximately the same number of hours I've worked ever since. I still work on my writing about 50 hours per week at age of 79. And I worked there 6 or 7 hours, 7 days a week, not counting my classes and classwork. And I wrote in pencil, I wrote 8 drafts of Catman in pencil, and then typed up the 8th draft. Of course, you don't turn in a handwritten manuscript, you turn in a typed script. Yeah, it has 110,000 words in it, and I worked about 11,000 hours on it. And the whole thing is in iambic meter. It's not in iambic pentameter. Of course, I wasn't writing poetry, I was writing prose, but it's in iambic meter. And by the time I finished, if you had opened it at random, let's say you opened to page 23 and put your finger on a sentence and read that sentence to me, I could have recited, I think it's 310 pages, I could have recited the entire book to you from page 23 to page 310. That's how, I'm trying to explain how hard I worked. But I worked so hard, partly because I couldn't talk. So, I mean, in the evening, I mean, after classes, I had friends. I ate supper. I didn't eat supper alone. I ate, in my dorm, my house, as they called it, dining room. But after that, I had no dates. So I would go back to the library and work like a dog. But happily, a happy dog. I loved writing. I always have loved writing. So that's one reason I was so precocious, and sold my first book before I even graduated.
This particular book, it seems to me, the language was very gritty for the time.
Yeah, well, that's one.
And so, tell me about that. Did you have any problems with the publisher saying, I think you're going a little too strong here? As I referred to earlier, without going into detail,
obviously, when I sold my book to a publisher, it was a big deal to me, needless to say. And so I was so proud, I showed the proofs to my father, which turned out to be a great mistake, because when he read the thing, he decided it would be banned by the post office, and it would hurt his career as a Wall Street lawyer. He worked for Exxon, but he was a financial lawyer. and that it would perhaps prevent my sister from marrying, making a good marriage. And, might hurt their social life at the country club. So anyway, he wrote to Houghton Mifflin's lawyer, who he knew because he passed a lot of, he worked for what's now called Exxon. He passed a lot of Exxon's legal business to this Boston lawyer, his name was Charles Curtis. He's very good. Was also Houghton Mifflin's, asking that the book be held up and not be published, precisely because of what you described as grittiness. And so I was, at that time, I was still trying to be a great novelist, of course. So I was out on the Mississippi. I was about to be drafted. I'd volunteered when the book was finished. I sold the book before I graduated from college, but it was not finished, and I had to spend another year. I lived on Beacon Hill at $6 per week at the top of Beacon Hill. This is back in 55, 54, 55. Finishing the book, and at that time, I told when I finished it, I told my draft board I was ready to be drafted, and they said okay. They scheduled me for drafting. But in the meantime, I went out to St. Louis because it was not the smartest idea in the world, but I wanted a great novel. I was going to find it on the Mississippi. I got this call from Houghton Mifflin saying, would you fly back to Boston? We'll pay your airfare, but we have to talk to you before we publish this book, which was a great shock to me. I was counting on it coming out, needless to say. And so I flew back to Boston, and I was called into the office of the editor-in-chief, Paul Brooks, and also Charlie Curtis, this lawyer who I didn't know. First of all, they asked me if I was happy with the number of times that the words such as piss were used in the book, and I said yes. It's important because I'm describing a life in which people, of course, use this language, but where it's a reality. And so I am. And they said, or I guess it was particularly Brooks, not the lawyer, because there was nothing illegal at that time about the word piss as opposed to other words. And Paul Brooks said, "Are you sure you don't want to take out some of those words?" And I said, "No, I really don't want to." And he said, "Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to insist on that." But then they said, on a certain page, which I can't remember where, but it's a scene that's pictured on the cover of that first paperback that was published by NAL in '58, 2 years after the hardcover came out, where the young man is crouching in front of the pretty blonde woman. They said, now, why is he crouching in front of this woman there? And of course, the reason was, I was still, as I say, a virgin. All I knew was just the regular missionary position. Heard about it, never done it. So I didn't know what they were talking about. And they said, no, but why is he crouching in front of her? So they looked at each other after a little while, and they smiled and they said, he doesn't know what we are talking about. We're trying to put something in his mind that is not there. He doesn't know, which is true. He has no idea what we're talking about. And they said, fine, we'll publish the book. And Time magazine, this would be in the middle of January '56. The quote we could use as a blurb is, it says, descriptions that top anything of the kind in fiction. You can't beat that. They began the review by saying, it's like, I mean, for people who go to the circus, it's like picking up a rug and finding out what really is underneath it. In other words, it warns potential readers that if they don't want to be disillusioned about the circus, they shouldn't read this book. But if they are prepared, for what's under the rug, they will find descriptions. What they're really talking about is the big cat specifically. I got my picture in Time magazine, and it was also reviewed in Newsweek. That they didn't use a picture of me in News. They used a picture of the circus, but in each case, when it came out, it was. As I say, in Time and Newsweek, of course, the New York Times, and all those places, and Saturday Review. But by that time, I was a private in the Army, so I was stationed in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, Valley Forge Army Hospital. I was a lab technician in the hospital lab. But when the book came out, I had no idea what was happening, and I would be walking down a sidewalk on the post, Army post, and some officer would be coming toward me, and he'd say, this is when it came out in January of '56, "Aren't you Private Hall? You Private Hall?" I say, "Yes, sir." He said, "Did you know did you know your picture's in Life magazine this week?" "No, sir," which I didn't. But it's actually happened. The book didn't sell very well. I mean, it sold around 6,000 copies, hardcover, and as I say, it's been reprinted by 4 different paperback companies. In fact, it's still in print. But it hasn't made money for them. They originally sold for $3.75.
Okay.
Which is what hardcover sold for then.
Right. And why was it reprinted so many times?
Well, I assume it's because it's unique. So if you work that hard on a book, and the subject matter is as flamboyant as a circus, and you were writing about what you love, which is what I was doing, what I've always done, the book ought to be reprinted. I mean, that's 2 of my first journal from British Columbia, which is called Notes from the Century Before, which has also been reprinted 4 different times in paperback.
Most of the events that you wrote about in the book happened, and, and the people were real. It was that you submerged yourself into into Fiddler.
Fiddler. Sure, yeah. I mean, I suppose you could use the word submerge. I used him as a vehicle for for my own experiences. Now, obviously, he was not a Harvard student, and he was not headed to write 21 more books, and he didn't come from an affluent background, and he hadn't had a Pulitzer Prize winning teacher.
And unlike you, he died fairly.
Well, the only reason he's killed by the lions is because I was just a kid and I simply didn't know how to end the novel. And one of the reasons that I am not primarily a novelist is that I've had that trouble with all of my novels. In fact, I have a Vermont novel right now that I haven't finished because I don't know how it ends. But unlike that, I'm not going to just kill the protagonist off. I only did that first time because I didn't know what else to do with him. But I would never. I never believed that could have happened to me, and it never did happen to me. That I was never harmed by the cat.